All right, so how many of you saw the information that I put out on the Blackboard course website? Okay, for those of you who didn't, you really need, particularly in situations like what happened last week, coming back from that, you really need to monitor the information on the course website. So for those of you who haven't looked at it, you need to pour through. All right, so how many of you saw the information that I put out on the Blackboard course website? Okay, for those of you who didn't, you really need, particularly in situations like what happened last week, coming back from that, you really need to monitor the information on the course website. So for those of you who haven't looked at it, you need to pour through the information that I've provided, because I'm not going to invest the time in today's class to go through it in detail. But I do want to touch on a few things. So let me open up the announcements. Here's the course homepage for this Texas government course. This announcements widget, if you click on this thing, it's laid out the same for you guys when you see it, right? You have that. Okay, you click on more announcements. There's a couple here that if you were to be looking at it right now, you wouldn't see these yet because they're not activated. Yeah, but no, this one's not, right? This one won't be activated until Friday, all right? This one too won't be activated until Friday, but there are other ones here that are already out there. This one I activated yesterday, and it's the main announcement that you need to read. It kind of lays out the catch-up plan, okay? And as I said, I'm not going to go through all the details because you can read that on your own. But I do want to say a couple of things. First of all, it happened in the previous class, and as I spoke to somebody in the online class who was attending the live session, it's subject to some tinkering. Okay, the way I laid it out here, doesn't mean that I can't entertain, issues that you see with it. Okay, but what I was thinking mainly was I think it's important for us to get back on track where we should be. Okay, so this is week 6 of the semester. We lost week 5 in terms of actual meeting time. So my idea is that let's just jump right back into week 6, okay, not fall behind, because when you do that, it kind of builds. You keep falling behind. So I just want to jump back in on week 6. And it means that you have to go back and pick up week 5. Now you can do that essentially at your leisure through the end of the semester. Well, through the end of week 15. We're going to leave final exam week 16 as not. But all the way through May 8th, you can go back and pick up week 5. Okay? And the way that you do that is you come up here to this content area that I created. It says week 5 catch-up content area. You click on that, and I've outlined some tasks for you here. Okay, the changes are in red. Okay, and instead of obviously having live class sessions for the material that we would have covered last week on federalism, I provided some other information for you. These are video files that I created years ago. They're not high entertainment value. Please don't expect that. Okay, most of them are pretty short, 5 minutes or so. Then there's this audio file, radio, NPR, National Public Radio file here that is about 19 minutes. That's part of it. You need to have a listen to that. And then there's this professionally produced video here called McCulloch versus Maryland about the famous case, United States Supreme Court decision over 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago. So you need to have a look at that. So that's really the equivalent of what we would have covered last week. Okay. So you can go back between now and the end of the semester and pick that up. Okay. Now, moving on to week 6, we're not going to take quizzes in class this week, okay? We're going to let you do those online. You'll do the week 5 quizzes. You have until May 8th to do the week 5 quizzes, okay? But since we're jumping back into week 6, I've set up this special area here for you for the week 6 quizzes. And you, again, if you were to click on this right now, week 6 quizzing area, you wouldn't see anything, okay? But they're already set up and ready to go. And you need to do those. It'll open Friday and be open through the end of the day on Saturday. So you have 2 days you can get in and do those. Once you get into a quiz, it's still the 5-minute limit on the reading quiz and the 7-minute quiz on the 7-minute limit on the lecture quiz. Okay? That to me seemed to be the easiest way to get us back on track. Okay? But again, as I said, if you have any concerns, I'm happy to listen to what your concerns are. Because there was a couple of things that were raised in the last class meeting that I thought were valid concerns. But it may have been particular to that course. You know, it may have been to the federal government course. It may not be the same kind of concerns that would be raised in a Texas government course.
The core is still due this week.
That was one of the issues that was raised. It's not. It wouldn't be the. Yeah, it'd be at the end of this. Originally set in the court syllabus to be due at the end of this week. Okay. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you exactly what I told the woman who asked that question. Let me think about it. Okay. If I make the change for one class, I'll make it for all the classes. Okay. And I'm not adverse to the entertaining pushing it back a week. I don't want to push it back beyond a week. Okay. But I need some time to think about it this afternoon because I just need time to think out what might be the advantages and disadvantages of doing that. Okay. But like I said, I'm not immediately knee-jerk reaction against it. And I think there's probably a pretty good chance that we can do that. Okay. And that may relieve a little bit of the press that you're going to feel over the next few days. But I think by laying out the plan the way that I've laid out, I think that we get through that period of where you're pressing faster than if we tried to string it out longer. Okay, good. Any other questions or concerns?
So you're going to send out a message to let us know whether you...
I will. If I make, you're talking about what he's asking about, the core competency? Yeah, I'll put an announcement on the course website. Say that the deadline was extended, if that's what we end up doing. Okay, so again, this week, no quizzes in class, but you do have quizzes. They're just going to be administered online.
Discussion?
Thank you for asking. I mentioned this in the announcement. We're just canceling altogether the discussion boards for week 5 and week 6. Okay. We'll get back on track with that next week. Okay. That also, I hope, relieves a little bit of the press that you'll feel. It also means that the ones, rather than administering 14 of them, we'll end up administering 12 of them, and so they have to be reweighted. Because I'm still going to drop 4, okay? And that means that 8 will count rather than 10. And whereas they were formerly 2 percentage points each, now they'll be, I think, 2.5 percentage points each. Yeah, I was telling the other class that since I came to WCJC, fall semester 2013, we have shut down so many times. I mean, in the 7 years that I've been here, we shut down more time, in fact, many times more than we did at the college that I was at for 23 years. I was at a college for 23 years. We shut down one time for winter, for ice. That was for anything, right? And here, we've had at least a half dozen weather shutdowns, including the previous ice storm and, of course, flooding, the Memorial Day floods and the Hurricane Harvey and all that. But we also had that ridiculous hacking incident 2 or 3 years ago in the spring semester that shut us down at the beginning of the semester. I think I brought a curse upon the college because it happened like as soon as I started.
Wait, someone was hacking? Wait, what?
The college's computer system was hacked and we had to shut down. It was a serious thing. It was that ransomware thing.
Oh, wow.
Okay. You know, I'm talking like I know what it was, and I have to be honest with you, I never really cared what it was, only that it shut us down for a long time.
So did that guy get his grades? Did he change?
I don't know if it was the ransomware. Okay. I gotta hope that, speaking of computer problems, I gotta hope that this works, because it was acting funny when I opened it up before the class started. So let's see. So the topic for week 6 is voting in elections. And I want to begin with a discussion of voting rights and restrictions on suffrage rights, okay? A couple of general observations to begin. When Texas became a state in the United States in 1845, by that time, property qualifications for the right to vote had been dropped in the United States for the most part. And so when Texas became a state, you didn't have to own property in order to exercise the right to vote, okay? However, it was still very restricted. And obviously African Americans couldn't vote and women could not vote. So we're talking about mainly white males that would have enjoyed the right to vote at the time that Texas became a state in the United States. All right. But, you know, I guess one thing I'll say here at the outset, as we're going to see as we go along with this discussion, is that the expansion of voting rights or democracy more generally has been a gradual process, right? And this perhaps is maybe the first step or one of the first steps in extending the right to vote to common people, where you don't have to be like some rich, property person in order to exercise the right to vote. Okay, early 19th century, and certainly by the time Texas became a state. All right, much of the subsequent history of the state in this regard is the story of the efforts of women and members of racial and ethnic minority groups to gain the right to vote and participate meaningfully in Texas politics. So that's really the focus of our discussion today. The extension of suffrage rights to women and the extension of suffrage rights regardless of race or ethnicity. Okay? All right. I want to begin with the story of women's voting rights. Okay? Mainly because that's how it's set up in the presentation here. Okay? Couple of definitions here before we dive in. The word suffrage means the right to vote. So the women's suffrage movement, some of you may be aware of this, but I've found that many semesters I have at least a few students who are surprised by this fact. The effort to extend voting rights without regard to gender actually goes back to the early part of the 19th century, the 1830s. Okay? And it really began as an offshoot of the abolitionist movement, which of course, as you know, was the reform effort, the goal of which was to eliminate the institution of slavery. So what we find is a lot of the same people who were involved in the abolitionist movement are also involved in the women's suffrage movement. So we're going to come back to the issues of race and ethnicity and begin with women's. Was worried about this. Let's see what's going on here. Bear with me for just a second.
You're good. I get a chance to finish writing it down.
Let's see here. Let me try something. I apologize. Hold on just a second. Well, none of these are coming open.
Is it on your computer, can you see it or no?
Is it what?
On your computer, can you see it?
No, no,
I
no.
was saying, I was
No,
gonna say,
you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing.
You might have to, I was gonna say, well, talk it out for us.
Well, I will. I just wanted to show you some pictures. I mean, it's not that important that I'm gonna waste a lot of time with it, but no, it's doing the same thing. There's something wrong with this file, I think.
Yeah.
So it's only going to 3? It won't even move down?
Well, we'll see. Hold on. Let me give it a chance to. Okay, so some of the early individuals that were important in the struggle for women's suffrage include Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, the Quaker orator Lucretia Mott. Okay, Lucretia Mott. You're probably not going to see these names on a quiz. Okay. I just wanted to give you, like some names to put with this movement. There was a women's rights convention that was held in 1832, I believe, in Seneca Falls, New York. It's oftentimes referred to as the birthplace of women's rights, or specifically women's suffrage, Seneca Falls, New York, because of this convention. And one of the things that they debated at this convention was the question of women's suffrage. And they produced a resolution calling for the amendment to the United States Constitution, giving women the right to vote. Again, that's one of those things that I have found in the past some of my students find surprising. Okay, that as early as 1832, some people were calling for an amendment to the Constitution to give women the right to vote. Okay. Also, that convention produced this document called a Declaration of Sentiments, and I'm really, I would like to click on this so we can actually see it, but I'm not going to run the risk that there's some sort of glitch with the program here. You can go out and Google if you're interested, and some of you may be interested. Okay. It's definitely worth reading if you find this kind of stuff interesting. Just go out and Google, a Declaration of Sentiments. It's the document that was produced by this convention, and it reads very similar. It's modeled on the Declaration of Independence. The language, the verbiage, in fact, is modeled on the Declaration of Independence. But some of you might find it striking how direct and strongly worded this document is about the way that women are treated in our society and the kind of changes that ought to be brought for women as human beings. Okay, so if you're interested, go out and Google Declaration of Sentiments and give it a read. It's not a long document. Yes.
So how long was this before women's rights, fully went through?
Well,
or even the talk of, or really it moving forward and rolling out?
Okay, so I was going to get to that point. Since you asked the question, let me go ahead and say this. So as early as the 1830s, we have this movement beginning in some earnest, right? And so this Seneca Falls Convention was really the first, but there was a series of other conventions that were held around the United States, Women's Rights Convention. Here's one. I think this is kind of the bill from the poster from a convention that was held in Ohio, I believe. I can't really read that again. I don't want to click on it. Here's the one from Ohio, a National Women's Rights Convention that was held in Cleveland, Ohio. This is, the 1853 that says. Right? So you go through the 1830s, the 1840s, into the 1850s, and this movement is really picking up some steam, okay? But then the Civil War intervenes, and the women's rights advocates made the deliberate decision to put off the cause of women's rights and women's suffrage in particular in favor of abolition of slavery. Okay, that's why these two are so closely connected. Okay, so all the energy goes into that abolitionist movement by the time we get to the 1850s. Yes.
Do you think, I'm pretty sure the Red Cross was formed during the Civil War, which is mainly a lot of women who were nurses. Do you think that may have helped later on the abolition movement?
Maybe. I don't know enough about the history of that organization and its relation to other, social movements and so on. But I will say this, I certainly wouldn't be shocked if somebody gave me some literature to read and that connection was made, because this, even though I just told you that it sort of takes a back seat, gets put on the back burner in favor of the abolitionists, it never goes away, all right? And after the Civil War, it begins to pick up steam again. So you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony that form an organization called the National Association. Boy, I wish I had the ability to click on these things because, oh, here's one. National Association of Women's Suffrage Association or something like National American Women's Suffrage Association. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but they identified as their goal instead of a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote nationally, to attack it on a state-by-state basis. They think that the best strategy politically is to pursue a state-by-state. Okay, so Wyoming becomes the first place in the United States in 1869 to give women the right to vote. Now, again, that's one of those things that a lot of my students seem to be surprised. Wyoming, of all places. Well, the argument that many historians make is that it was an effort to attract women to Wyoming. Why else would women go to Wyoming? Right? I don't know if that argument is overstated, but I think there's some truth to that argument to civilize, quote unquote, civilize Wyoming in the West. It's certainly not a coincidence that we get the movement for women's suffrage is a Western state phenomenon in the latter part of the 19th century.
What year was that?
It's either 1869 or 1870. I can't remember. Okay? For some reason, I want to say 1869, but just ballpark it.
Yeah.
Okay? If you were to see a question on the quiz that says Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1967, you would know, hey, that's way off. Okay?
You better not put 69 and 70 because that would be like,
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. But it's easy enough to get the answer if you must know the answer, right? It's easy enough to get that answer. Okay, but again, look at this map here, and you can see the states shaded in red are the ones that are the first to give women the right to vote. So it's a Western state phenomenon, and it moves from west to east. Okay?
Now, how did the men react to that? To the giving the right of women to suffrage? How did they act to that? They're the main proponents of them not being able to vote. So how did the South and the East react to it, and then how did the Western?
Well, men would have had to have been part of the process.
Yeah.
If this broke down, if women don't have the right to vote before they get the right to vote, right?
Yeah.
It would have to be a role
Yeah, I know what
for.
I'm saying, like, how did the other states react to it that took longer?
Yeah, there was a lot of reluctance in the South and on the East Coast. Like I said, it moves from west to east. It's definitely a Western state phenomenon in the late 19th and even into the early part of the 20th century. So consider, for example, that the Texas Women's Suffrage Association here picks up steam, is founded in Texas. So it doesn't really come to Texas until the turn of the 20th century. Okay. By 1918, though, the Texas legislature has passed a law allowing women to vote in primary elections. Now, we're going to make a distinction probably on Thursday, maybe happen today, but more likely on Thursday. We're going to talk about different types of elections that we have in Texas, but and one of those types is primary elections. So it's interesting to note here that the Texas legislature is willing to give women the right to vote in 1918 in primaries, but not in general elections. Okay?
It's weird that they did it like right around the end of World War I.
I don't know what other than, I don't know that it's a coincidence. I don't know that it's not a coincidence, but why do you think it's weird?
It's just like they have this whole war going on. They're thinking, I would think they'd be mainly focused on the whole World War going on. It just seemed.
Yeah, I think I understand your point, but during wartime, a society, including the United States, we aren't like totally single-minded. I mean, there are still other concerns that people have and issues that people bring forward. In fact, sometimes wars accentuate those issues, or they sort of bring them to the surface.
Yeah.
In terms of racial integration, World War II played an important role in that, as some of you may already know. You know, it was World War II when Harry Truman integrated American armed services, which was really kind of the first major institution in our society which was racially integrated. Okay, so 1918, and then in 1919, the United States Congress formally proposes a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. And as you can see there, I noted that Texas was the first southern state to ratify it. And it was officially ratified by the 3/4 of the states and became part of the Constitution in 1920. So just over 100 years ago, women. Were you aware last year and all that went on last year with COVID and the presidential election and so on? Was anybody aware that it was the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in the United States? Okay.
There's a whole pandemic.
So with that, the story I'm giving, look, this isn't a history course. You can take a history course and get a lot more detail, I'm sure. I'm just trying to give you a real quick overview of the timeline of how the right to vote for women came to pass. But once the amendment was added to the Constitution, it pretty much was a settled issue. At least, certainly just in terms of the right to vote. Now, there obviously have been lingering issues with respect to other forms of participation for women. I mean, it's only been very recently that, you know, women have been getting elected to office more and more, but there was no legal barriers to that once the constitutional amendment was added. Okay? All right. So having said that, I want to shift gears and move on to expansion of the suffrage rights with respect to race or without respect to race. So again, a couple of terms here at the top that you need to have an understanding of. Franchise, again, is the right to vote. To enfranchise means to grant the right to vote. And disenfranchise would suggest, not on the screen, but what would you think that means? Take away or deny the right to vote. Now that's important, probably should be up there on the screen, because a lot of the efforts that we're going to talk about are really efforts to disenfranchise. Okay? All right, so when the Civil War ended slavery in the United States, certainly after Reconstruction is the period immediately following the Civil War. Civil War ends in 1865. Reconstruction runs from 1865 to 1875. Okay? After Reconstruction, the white elite establishment is returned to power in Texas and really throughout the South. Okay? There was that brief period of time during Reconstruction where actually African Americans in the South had the right to vote. There were even some places in the South where former slaves held office. There was one state in the country, for example, South Carolina, where a majority, during Reconstruction, where a majority of the seats were held by former slaves. Because at the same time that Congress is passing this legislation, you get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments added to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment, which is a very important provision of the Constitution. It's kind of complicated. I won't go into it just right here. But the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, right? The 15th Amendment, which was added to the Constitution in 1870, says that the right to vote shall not be abridged regardless of race, creed, color, previous condition of servitude. But here's a lesson in the real world. Just because you add some words to the Constitution doesn't necessarily make it so, because most of you know enough about your history to know that for another 100 years, in many parts of the country, particularly in the South, African Americans were effectively denied the right to vote. They may not have been barred outright, but there were enough impediments to the right to vote that they were effectively disenfranchised. Okay, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the others. Okay, so by the time you get to the end of Reconstruction, you have this period of Reconstruction, 10 years, where in many parts of the South, you get, African Americans are voting and even holding public office. But by the end of Reconstruction, the old white power structure has I know what I was going to say, and I kind of glossed over it. At the time during Reconstruction that you have African Americans enfranchised, given the right to vote, you also have former Confederates that are disenfranchised, all right, as a punishment for treason against the United States. They have their right to vote taken away from them, and their right to hold public office, or their opportunity to hold public office, taken away from them. You see what I'm saying? So, just think about how the numbers might get skewed, right? Many whites can't vote. Okay, many whites can't hold public office during Reconstruction. African Americans, for the first time, can vote, and they can hold public office. So you can imagine there would be places in the country, particularly in the South, where you have large African American populations, where you might get African Americans elected, given that dynamic, right? Like South Carolina. Okay, but by the time, I keep saying by the time Reconstruction comes to an end, well, what happens, again, this is not a history course, and it's not really the forum for really getting into the details about what brought Reconstruction to an end. There's some political compromise between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats that come about, but basically whites are re-enfranchised, and the old power structure reemerges in the South. So, for example, in Texas, at the time that Reconstruction comes to an end, and throughout the rest of the 19th century, you have more and more impediments being put in place for African Americans to vote. So we get down to the turn of the 20th century, and of the 650,000 potential African American voters, only 25,000 were qualified to vote under Texas law. That's the extent to which these impediments were put into place after Reconstruction. That is a significant reduction. Go from 65,000 potential voters to only 650,000 to only 25,000. That tells you that some of these devices were really very effective, right? So what kind of devices are we talking about? Well, let's start with the white primary, okay? It's important to understand what a primary is, okay? Basic distinction that we make here is between the primary and the general election, okay? In a primary, the political parties have an election to nominate their candidates to run for office.
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, a primary that a lot of textbooks and other sources call them primary elections. I really resist the temptation to call them primary elections, because no one's being elected to office as a result of a primary vote. But it has all the trappings of an election. That is to say, people go into voting booths and they cast their ballots for their favorite candidate. But it's not to pick who the governor is going to be or who the senator is going to be. It's to pick who your party's candidate for governor is going to be, or to pick who your party's candidate for senator is going to be, or representative. So you understand what I'm saying? So most offices in this country and in Texas are what we call partisan-based offices. There are some exceptions, okay? But all federal and state offices and county offices in Texas are elected on a partisan basis. That is to say, candidates run as nominees of political parties, okay? So, for example, in the last governor's election, which was 2018, well, let me pick a higher profile office. In 2018, there was a election in Texas for one of the two U.S. Senate seats. Does anybody know who the candidates were? Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke. Okay, I picked that deliberately because I figured most people would know those names. Okay, Ted Cruz first had to get the nomination of his party, the Republican Party. Okay? Now, that was a foregone conclusion because he was already the incumbent senator. Okay? But when he first ran in 2012 or whatever it was, he had some opponents in the Republican Party. Okay? And Beto O'Rourke had to get the Democratic Party's nomination, and he had to run against several other Democrats to get that nomination. So the primary comes first, as the word itself suggests. It's not an election, it's a nomination process. Okay? And then that's in the spring, okay? And then in March in Texas. And then the general election comes in November. So in the general election, you have the Democratic Party nominee versus the Republican Party nominee versus the Libertarian Party nominee versus, right? And whoever wins that election holds office, right, is elected to the office. That's, so we call those are properly called elections, right?
General election and just primary.
That's the way I say it, but I just want you to know that a lot of textbooks and other sources say primary elections.
But
I just like to say primaries and
I get
general
it.
elections.
It's just a nomination.
All right.
Who's gonna be the best Democrat?
Now,
So they don't have to have more competition.
yeah, because in a lot of these offices, you may have multiple Democrats who want that office or
Correct.
multiple Republicans, so you have to get down to just one. There are some states that do it a little bit differently, like California, for example, where you might have, several Democrats and several Republicans on the same ballot, and then you have a runoff between the two highest voters. It could potentially be two Democrats or two Republicans.
Wow.
But that's an exception. Most states are more like Texas in that regard. Okay? All right, so back on track here. Now that everybody has, I think, some understanding of what a primary versus general election is. Back in the early part of the 20th century, in fact, from the end of Reconstruction through the 1970s, for 100 years, Texas was what we consider to be a one-party state, Democratic Party dominance. To be elected in the general election in Texas, you had to be a Democrat. Okay? The first Republican that we had elected in a statewide election after Reconstruction didn't happen until 1960. And that was a U.S. Senate race where Republican John Tower won. And the first governor that we had elected, Republican governor that we had elected to Texas, was 100 years after Reconstruction, Bill Clements, who the high school over here is named after, right? They had all been Democrats for 100 years. You see what I'm saying? You pretty much had to be a Democrat in Texas in order to win the general election.
So even like before, it's been Democrat since Texas started.
Well, the period before the Civil War, Texas was a one-party Democratic state. And through the Civil War, Texas was a one-party Democrat. The white power establishment was Democratic. Okay? During Reconstruction, you had Republicans. The governor of Texas during Reconstruction was the former Union General E.J. Davis, okay, that you remember reading about in your chapter on Texas, on the Texas Constitution, right? And so because of Reconstruction, being a Republican in Texas was anathema. It was a curse, right? You could not get elected unless you were a Democrat. And the point I'm really trying to get to is that that meant that all the action was in the Democratic Party primary. Effectively, you determine who governor is in the Democratic Party primary.
That's why.
They still have to run in the general election, but the Republicans not gonna stand a chance. You're gonna know who the new U.S. senator is gonna be, whoever wins the Democratic Party primary, and all the other offices.
That makes sense. So is it African Americans who vote in the primary, which is the most important?
Yes.
Because you get to choose the literal person you guys want.
That's the point I'm trying to get to. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So the white primary, which we had in Texas and in other states in the South, prohibited African Americans from voting in the Democratic Party primary. Now, initially, that was just sort of a practice. Okay, but if you go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, that was just a practice. But you can see, I've indicated here that the Texas legislature actually passed a law in 1923 that prohibited African Americans from voting in the Democratic Party primary. So under Texas law, if you're African American, you can't vote in the Democratic Party primary. Now, there was a case that came out of El Paso, Texas, called Nixon versus Herndon. That's not former President Nixon. This is a
hope
a local official in El Paso County, okay, who is African American and who's denied the right to vote. Oh, I said official. He's a leader of the African American community. He's denied access to vote in the Democratic primary. He files a lawsuit. It goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court declares that law that was passed by Texas just the year before to be a violation of the 15th Amendment. Okay? It's unconstitutional. However, in the wake of that decision, that Nixon versus Herndon decision, the Texas Democratic Party passes a rule, an internal rule that prohibits African Americans from voting. And that goes before the Supreme Court in Grovey versus Townsend 10 years later. And the Supreme Court says here that the Democratic Party is a private organization. It's not the state of Texas. And so it can have whatever rules prohibiting whoever it wants from participating in its primary. So now we go back, we still have the white primary, okay?
And the Democratic Party runs Texas, so they're basically saying.
The effective, right?
You can't vote because it's us, that's us.
Okay, so that's 1934. 10 years later, in Smith versus Allwright, the same question comes before the Supreme Court again. And this time the Supreme Court says, well, the Democratic Party is not the state of Texas, but it is an agent of the state of Texas. It is essentially running the election process for the state of Texas. So it's acting in the name of and under the authority of the state of Texas. And the state of Texas cannot deny the right to vote on the basis of race. So Smith versus Allwright finally puts
20 years.
the white primary away. White primary is abolished by Smith versus Allwright. But the white primary was not the only disqualifier. Okay? I've lost a slide here somehow. Well, it's not in here. We'll just have to look at this one while I talk about the poll tax. Okay? The poll tax wasn't officially aimed at African Americans to keep African Americans from voting. It was something that any voter had to pay. Okay? I had a slide in here. I don't know what happened to it. It must be in another version of the slides, but a receipt from Harris County to a voter. It's, a little paper receipt that the voter filled out paying his poll tax in 1964. And it says on there, you're just gonna have to imagine what I'm describing to you. It says Harris County, Texas, Harold Rogers has paid $1.50, poll tax. Okay, now $1.50 may not sound like very much money. I did the adjustment several years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago or something like that for inflation. It would be more like $16 or $17 today. Okay? And I wonder how many of you think that that would be an effective deterrent to voting. There's some people who just aren't going to pay $20 just to go vote, particularly people on the low end of the income scale who may struggle to feed their kids or pay the utility bill or whatever the case is. They're going to make that sacrifice not to vote. Now, like it or not, the truth of the matter is, in this part of our history in Texas, African Americans were disproportionately poor. And so it disproportionately affected the African American community. In fact, most scholars and other observers believed that the real motivation of the poll tax was to keep African Americans. It also kept poor whites away from the polls to a large extent, but it was mainly to keep African Americans away in the wake of the abolition of the white primary. Okay? Now, in 1964, the Constitution of the United States was amended to eliminate the poll tax in federal elections. That is elections for president, elections for U.S. Senate, and elections for U.S. House of Representatives. States could not impose a poll tax for people who want to vote in presidential or congressional elections. Okay? However, states like Texas and Virginia created something called the dual ballot system. Okay? And essentially what these states are saying, Texas was one of them, is that, okay, we can't impose poll tax in presidential and congressional elections, but there's nothing stopping us from doing it in governor's elections or state legislative elections or county elections. Right? So you had this, what was called a dual ballot system, where if you wanted to vote in state elections, you had to pay the poll tax. That went before the Supreme Court very quickly. I think maybe the same
Why
year.
did they leave that out? They didn't think that through completely?
Well, because our Constitution is kind of weird in some ways, okay? Under our constitutions, states run elections, okay? Election laws to this day vary, in some cases, pretty significantly from state to state. They don't vary as much today as they did 50 years ago or whatever, but there's still a lot of variation in state laws. And that's the result of the fact that the Constitution leaves it to the states to run the elections, right? But when you're talking about federal offices like president and Congress, you can write into the Constitution through this amendment process. The quick answer to your question is I don't know. I mean, theoretically, they could have written the amendment in such a way as to prevent the dual ballot. I suppose the answer to that is political. I think maybe at that time in the 1960s, you still had a lot of very conservative Democrats in the South who were in the United States Senate in particular, and they would have blocked remember, it takes a 2/3 majority in the House and a 2/3 majority in the Senate to even propose an amendment, to formally propose an amendment. And if it had included all offices, state offices, I suspect that senators and representatives as well, but you never would have gotten the 2/3 majority in the Senate and the House. So it's one of those deals, I think, where the proponents say, well, get what we can now. Let's get what we can now. To borrow a phrase that I used in the last class in a completely different context, because it was something that applies to a different context, but to borrow from one of my heroes, Thomas Jefferson, better to have half a loaf than no bread at all.
That's true.
Right? So I think that's kind of the mentality. What?
They gotta get what they can get.
Yeah, I mean, things happen incrementally in a lot of ways. Yeah.
If I can have half a loaf, that might mean that there's you to make more bread and have more of it.
Well, there is some argument to be made. I think you're right that, just getting a little piece done initially provides momentum to getting another piece done down the road. If you go radical, as some people might perceive it at that time, and go all in or nothing, you're probably, in most cases, going to get nothing.
Or a lot of fight you with your numbers, that's it. Then the chances of you making it happen.
It's a terribly unsatisfying reality for people who are being discriminated against. You understand, right? It's a terribly horrible reality to face, that we can't be treated as human beings except incrementally. Okay. So you have two cases that go before the Supreme Court. Again, I think in 1964, Texas versus the United States and Board of Electors versus Virginia. One, obviously the first one coming out of Texas, the second one coming out of Virginia, that deal with the same issue, this dual ballot system. The Supreme Court strikes both of them down. That puts an end to the poll tax. So by the mid-1960s, we put it into the poll tax.
Virginia and Texas are the only states that did that?
No, but by implication, other states that had them. If the Supreme Court's going to strike down Texas and Virginia, any other states that have similar poll tax laws are going to run the risk of the Supreme Court striking theirs down as well, if the case comes before. So the general, it's like in other areas of case law, like say Miranda versus Arizona, the famous Miranda warnings, right? Why did police departments all across the country start administering the right to, you have a right to remain silent, you have a right to have an attorney present there. Why did they start doing it? Based on one case out of Arizona? Because they don't want their convictions to be overturned because they didn't do it.
Yeah,
They'll make sure that.
I got it.
Okay, yeah, cases that have similar facts and similar issues of law tend to be decided the same way by the courts. So the same would be true here in the dual ballot system. Okay. Okay. There are other devices that tend to be used by. Bear with me here for just a second. There are other devices that tend to be used by states. Did I ever get anybody online? I sure did. I apologize. Who's online? Amin. I apologize. I haven't been sharing my screen with you because when I first checked, there was nobody online. Tell me what you see on your screen right now. Do you see do you see something that says minority voting rights? Okay, good. I just want to make sure that you can see it. Thank you. All right, now bear with me here for just a second. I want to find something for you, just to finish off this story about African American voting rights. I should have called this up before I started. Okay, so several years ago, I had a class where we were talking about these very issues, and I had a discussion board that was open, and it was just sort of an open forum. They weren't doing the versus pairs the way that we are now, but I had a student who posted a message to that discussion board, a question that I thought was quite insightful. And I thought I would answer it, and I'm going to share that answer, the question and the answer with you. So this is from the fall semester of 2014, and she writes, as I'm rewriting my notes, you all rewrite your notes, right? As I'm rewriting my notes, I believe her, by the way, just because I know what kind of student she was, I can still remember. As I'm rewriting my notes, I see that in 1900, there were 650,000 people that were potential voters. That's the point that I made to you earlier about the 650,000 African Americans who would have otherwise been qualified to vote under Texas law. Yet only 25,000 were actually able to vote. What were the state laws that allowed them to vote and not the others? How did they choose who was capable of filling? In other words, she's saying, why did these 25,000 African Americans get to vote, but not the other 600? Yeah. Okay, so here's my answer to her. I should have just been honest and say I don't know. No, here's my answer to her. Just to be clear, the 650,000 number refers to the number of African Americans in Texas who would have been eligible to vote had various restrictions not existed. 25,000 refers to the number of African Americans who actually qualified to vote in Texas at that time. Of course, significant restrictions that limited the ability of African Americans to exercise the franchise in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The white primary and poll taxes were we discussed in class. They got it in the form of video files. The poll tax was not specifically directed at only African Americans. Only anyone who could not pay the tax could not register to vote. Therefore, many Latinos and poor whites were disqualified by the poll tax as well. Whereas the overwhelming majority of African Americans in Texas were poor during this era, however, it served as an effective disqualifier. Other restrictions throughout the South, and not just in Texas, included grandfather clauses. You heard of these?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us what a grandfather clause is.
It's kind of like you hit the right age group to where you're still included in something before you get cut off.
Well, you're certainly on the right track.
I think it was, if I remember right, it's like if your grandfather was a slave, then you cannot vote.
Yeah, but typically they were worded differently so as to avoid problems with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They were worded more like if your grandfather was eligible to vote, then you're eligible to vote.
Oh, grandfather did.
Okay, so that excluded a couple of generations of African Americans in many places in the South if their grandfather had been a slave. Okay, literacy test, that was a big one. Not going to let you vote if you can't read. We can't trust you with this awesome responsibility of choosing elected leadership if you can't even read. So you're going to have to prove to us that you can read.
There's
Right?
a lot of poor whites that could review that.
Absolutely.
Farmers.
Restrictive and arbitrary registration practices that were not necessarily codified in state laws, but nonetheless served as effective barriers to voting. These included requiring frequent re-registration, long terms of residence in a district, registration at inconvenient times like during planting season, provision of information unavailable to many blacks, such as street addresses when black neighborhoods lack street names. There was you all know where the Heights is in Houston?
Yeah.
Okay, there was a neighborhood, there was an area of Houston right next to the Heights that was African American. It was actually the first incorporated majority African American city in Texas. But the streets in that part of Houston didn't have numbers, so that disqualified all those voters under these kinds of requirements. Okay. When blacks managed to qualify for the vote, even under these measures, registrars would use their discretion to deny them the vote anyway. This is from a source called Race, Voting Rights, and Segregation. You can see the full citation there. If somebody wants it, I'll be happy to shoot it to them. Additionally, in Texas, requirements of property ownership to vote in local elections and bond elections disproportionately affected the largely propertyless racial, ethnic minority populations until it was finally ruled to be unconstitutional. Article 6, Section 3 of the Municipal Election Code and the qualification of voters of the Texas Constitution provided all of the qualified electors, it should say, that just means voters, all qualified voters in the state, as herein described, who shall have resided for 6 months immediately preceding an election within the limits of any city or corporate town, shall have the right to vote for mayor and all other elective offices, but in all elections to determine the expenditure of money or assumption of debt, only those shall be qualified to vote who pay taxes on property in said city or incorporated town. So if it's a money issue, like the city appropriating money, which is what they do, right? Or a tax issue or something like that, raising the sales tax rate or the property tax rate, something like that, you had to be a property owner. And again, that didn't specifically aim at African Americans, but it certainly disproportionately affected African Americans. And there are other here's. I'm not going to read through this whole thing with you, but a lot of the rest of this has to do with the Supreme Court eliminating these property requirements. And they do so, by the way, not on the basis of the 15th Amendment, which says that the right to vote shall not be abridged with respect to race, creed, color, previous condition of servitude. They do it on the basis of the 14th Amendment, where they say, the Supreme Court says it's an invidious discrimination and it's a violation of the equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment, that the states shall not deprive persons within their jurisdiction of the equal protections of the laws. The court is concluding that requiring having property ownership requirements does not provide equal protection of the laws. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, if, for example, the state of Texas said, we're not going to let children go to school unless their parents pay property taxes, everybody would probably, oh, wait a minute, hold on, what are you talking about? Of course you can't do that. That would be a violation of the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause. It's a similar, not exactly the same, but it's a similar sort of logic where the court is saying, you can't deprive people of this constitutional right to vote just because they don't own property. So that's not specifically the 15th Amendment, it's an interpretation or application of the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection. Okay, let's see. So to return to the original point, While these property ownership qualifications under Texas law were not specifically directed at African Americans or Latino residents, they were in place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Texas, disproportionately affecting racial and ethnic minorities since the overwhelming number of African American Latinos in the state did not own property during this period. I hope this explanation helps clarify. Yes, this does help, in fact. So, you know, that's I thought was a good question that she raised, because, you know, sometimes I go through this material, I'll say something like 650,000 were qualified, otherwise qualified to vote. And I said, well, you know, most people just kind of let that slide. You know, well, why were they not qualified? I thought that was a, you know, a simple but good question.
You wrote an essay.
I did.
That's a discussion vote.
Okay, questions about what we've said here with respect to minority voting or African American voting rights? Yeah.
Sort of have a question. So would you say that it is like apt to say that it is like directly racial policies that are explicitly about race became less acceptable and became less and less, well, not less constitutional, but became accepted as being not constitutional more and more often, that the government, a lot of state governments sort of found ways to repurpose class warfare tactics to, I mean, they expanded the middle class in like the 40s and 50s, but to try to move a lot of African Americans into the lower class, and then, you know.
Yeah, I think if I follow your logic, I think I would agree with that. Maybe another way to say that, and you can tell me if this is kind of what you're getting at. Whereas direct and overt discriminations became unconstitutional as a result of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, those who were intent on discriminating became more clever.
Yeah.
You just find clever ways to get around it. Like I was saying with the grandfather clauses, right? If you were to say in law that if your grandfather was a slave, you can't vote, okay? Or your father or your grandfather was a slave, you can't vote, that would clearly be racial, because we only had African American slaves, okay? But if you say, if your father was eligible to vote or your grandfather was eligible to vote, you're also eligible to vote.
Very clever way to be racist.
It is a clever way to be racist. Because you do understand that there were some parts of the country where African Americans made advances with respect to the right to vote earlier than what we're talking about. So in some parts of the country, you may have had handfuls of African Americans who could vote in some parts of the country because their father or their grandfather would have been eligible to vote. But in places like Texas. All right, let's talk very, not to give short shrift to Latinos, but let's talk, in the limited time that we have available, let's talk a little bit about how Latinos were affected in Texas. Okay? The main thing that we need to know about Latino voting rights in Texas is the system of boss control. Right? In Texas, really through about the 1960s or even the 1970s. Is there a problem? Oh, through about the 1960s and the 1970s, you had this very pronounced boss system, particularly in South Texas, where heavily Hispanic areas, political bosses, white political bosses, particularly ranch owners, controlled the local economies and the local politics. So even though the white primary didn't keep Latinos from voting, political bosses often did, or when they did permit Latinos to vote, they controlled their vote, right? Now, I'm going to share with you the story of George Parr. This little blurb that you see on the side, I didn't write up. This came from the Texas State Historical Society. So I just copied it and pasted it here. There you see the photo of George Parr. He was one of the South Texas bosses, and he was known by the Latin American laborers, Mexican American laborers, who worked his ranch and throughout South Texas as the El Patron, the Duke of Duval County. Yeah, I can't read it that way. Okay, so in the role of El Patron for the impoverished Mexican-American laborers who formed the majority of the county population, George Parr served as the mainstay of the Democratic Party machine. He became fluent in Spanish, tirelessly learned the names of his constituents and their children, and provided help in times of need in return for one concession: absolute loyalty. Under his leadership, both corruption and paternalism flourished in Duval County. Okay, so this was fairly typical of the arrangement that you saw in most places in South Texas, most counties. This just happens to be the guy that was in charge in Duval County. Okay, he was ultimately convicted of federal tax evasion and served a federal income tax, served a federal sentence for income tax, committed suicide at his ranch in 1975. Yes, according to the Texas State Historical.
Oh, according to.
I didn't know the I don't know the I only know what I read about him.
Is this a show? I feel like it'd be a good show.
Okay, so I think, you know, Parr is a good example of that kind of arrangement.
Wow.
All right. Oh, there's my poll tax thing. I did have it in here. Look at that. Okay, so let's review this information here real quick, okay? I said that the poll tax was a tax voters had to pay to register to vote. In 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes in elections for the presidency or Congress. As a result of the 24th Amendment, Texas adopted the dual ballot system, which could be collected for state and local elections, to get registered to vote in state and local elections. And again, 2 years later, I guess 1966, two cases came before the Supreme Court, Texas versus the United States and Harper versus Virginia State Board of Electors, in which the Supreme Court struck down the poll tax altogether. Okay, questions about any of that? Oh, here's that receipt I was talking about. You can see this is from Harris County, and you can see, where's the amount? Oh, there it is, right there, real small. Can you see it? A sum of $1.50.
Depending on the time, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said, you know, when I adjusted this about 7 years ago for inflation, and it's probably closer to, you know, 15 or something like that.
So 10 times the amount, basically, from that date, now, or 2013.
Okay, so yeah,
Doesn't that kind of combine with the like primary stuff too? Because you would be paying like $11 just to get screwed by a candidate you don't like anyways.
Well,
Is it sort of like a combined effort thing, or?
yeah, I mean, I think the double whammy up until 1944 of the white primary and the poll tax was a really effective deterrent. Okay, white primary is abolished in 1944, but you still have poll tax in place for another 20 years. All right, so what we see then from the time of getting rid of the white primary and the poll tax and some of these other, you know, literacy tests and grandfather clauses and so on that are melting away, slowly but surely melting away in the middle part of the 20th century. You see sort of this steady march toward expanding opportunities to vote. Okay? The movement is in the direction of allowing people to vote, making it easier for people to vote, and more people to vote, and a diversity of people to vote. Okay. In addition to that, I want to touch on a few other things here real quick. Okay. I'll save the last two or three for Thursday. Okay. In the early 1990s, federal law was passed, Act of Congress was passed, called the Motor Voter Law. What's that? Who's familiar with that? This was a law passed by Congress requiring states to give people the opportunity to register to vote at the time that they got or renewed their driver's license. Motor Voter Law. The idea again here is to make it easier for people to get registered. Do it at the same time. You get
Yeah.
driver's license, you have to get that. So why not go ahead at the same time and get people registered to vote? Clearly, the intent is to make it possible for more people to vote. Okay? Same day, or excuse me, election day registration. Texas is not one of the states that has this, but there are a number of states that have same day registration. And again, the idea is to allow more people to vote. I mean, if you have, like in Texas, for example, you have to be registered 30 days before the election. So some people aren't even really thinking about it until election day is imminent. I think this is the logic, right? Some people aren't even thinking about it until election day. They're busy with other things. They're trying to get their kids to school. They're trying to, pay the bills. Nobody's, thinking 30 days, or few people are thinking 30 days in advance, I got to get registered to vote. Okay, so if you allow people to register to vote on the same day as the election, then you're more likely to get better turnout or bigger turnout. Okay. Online voter registration. Many states have this now, of course. Texas is one of them that has online voter registration. No excuse absentee voting. This became a big deal in the 2020 election, didn't it? Okay, for the Trump campaign, right? The absentee voting. But interesting, look, Texas was one of the leaders when it came to no excuse absentee voting. What's the difference between absentee voting and no excuse absentee voting?
You have no excuse.
Well, of course. But, okay, so what's absentee voting?
You had this time to this time, like several weeks to vote. You could have done early voting, you could have done.
Well, that's early voting. That's early voting. That's something a little bit different. So this used to apply mainly to people like American, like people who were Americans who were living overseas or maybe in the military that could not be here on election day.
Yeah.
So they request an absentee ballot, they get the ballot sent to them, and they can send back. It used to be, including in Texas, that you had to have one of several excuses to qualify to get an absentee ballot, like being in the military. Okay? Texas dropped that requirement. All you had to, this was, I think, maybe back in the 1990s, where Texas changed it, where you don't even have to tell us why. Just request an absentee ballot, and you can get an absentee ballot. All right? So a number of states have that. Yeah, go ahead, Mom.
No, I was thinking about it.
Expand early voting. Now, that's what you were talking about, Miles. It's like, again, Texas is one of the leaders, believe it or not, in this area. Texas was one of the first states to have a couple of weeks before election day where people can vote. Makes it easier for people. They don't have to stand in lines on election day. They can kind of vote over a 2 or 3 week period, whatever it is, at their convenience. Again, the idea here is to make it easier for people to vote and presumably, therefore, increase voter turnout. Right? And here's another one that we have in some counties in Texas. I think Fort Bend County, for example, is one. It's not in all Texas counties, but I believe, certainly during the early voting period, but also, I think also on election day. Did anybody vote on election day? Or did you all vote you didn't vote in early voting, you voted in election day? And did you have to go, you didn't have to go to a specific polling place, right? You could go to any one in the county.
Back then, they did. Now you can go anywhere.
Right. Yeah, but not all Texas counties have that. Some Texas counties, you have to go to a specific polling place. Yeah. Okay. We're out of time. We'll talk. Okay. So what we've talked about here today is the slow march towards expanding the franchise and making it easier for people to vote. When we come back on Thursday, we'll talk a little bit, because we've got to move on to other things. We'll talk a little bit about how that's kind of ticked back in the opposite direction in recent years, just the last 10 years or so.